I suppose it's time I fully divulge the truth I have come to bear witness. Wait. I should do this properly. This is Professor Vernon Hawthorne. The date is... Damn it. I can't seem to recall. It was last autumn since last I checked. I am recording myself in order to best recount the wound tale that's haunted my every waking hour since its occurrence. If you've come to find this record, and I am nowhere to be seen, I imagine I've met a tragic fate. I believe this story requires a forewarning at the front end. I would say in the not-too-distant past, most in the community would refer to me as a decent, reputable man. Today I look into the mirror and see a coward I wish I could strangle to his most pitiful death. I am a drunk and a recluse who remains in his home, waiting for his manufactured demise, though I know not how it will happen, only that it will. The madness out there is bound to find its way into my domicile. If only I didn't. But how could I have known such an insignificant thing could become? It's all because of that damned... The day began as ordinary as any other. The only notable thing at the time had been the onset of the spring equinox, marking a pleasant day for Davy and I to take our usual walk throughout the neighborhood. The walk started off to quite a slow start. Davy, a Siberian husky, found himself particularly distracted this day by the myriad of scents wafting his way. I had attributed it to the renewal of life the season brings. At first, I recall being fairly annoyed by the constant stopping and going Davy put me through, until a sweet, floral scent brushed past me, carried by a gentle breeze. The fragrant aroma instantly put me at ease, and I allowed Davy the ample time to take in all he could. It seemed the neighborhood had also come out to enjoy the day. Indeed, a sleepy town, but one filled with pleasant and decent people. After the seemingly never-ending winters, it's no surprise the people cooped up in their houses jump at the chance to enjoy the change of the season. As I passed the small patch of grass known to the children of the town as the Circle, I could hear the sound of whooshing sticks whiffling through the air as the children played stickball. They howled and jeered at one another, each time one of them missed their swing, which seemed to be all of them. All at the deft hands of a boy known to me as Eugene, though his last name eludes me at the moment. Eugene and his family lived on the same block as Davy and I. In truth, I find most interactions with children irritating and awkward, but the boy Eugene was okay. Davy seemed to like it when the boy would run over and scratch behind his ears. Another breeze pushed past against me, and with it again the sweet floral smell. This time a bit stronger, but enough to ignite a sense of pleasantry to my senses. I allowed my nose to take the lead toward the sweet scent. It hadn't been our usual walking path, but Davy seemed pleased enough with the change of course. The straying path led us through an opening between some bushes that had looked as though they were trimmed and managed every so often. I shifted my thoughts towards identifying the peculiar scent. Honeysuckle, I assumed at first. And while I make no claims to be a botanist of any sort, I recalled it being too early in the season for honeysuckle to bloom. My next assumption regarding my limited list of floral knowledge had me considering it could have been jasmine. And if only it had been that simple. A simple flower. I'd have stopped for a moment, brought the flower to my nose, and after a few moments we'd have been on our way. There weren't too many others who seemed to share this divergent path. However, I came to pass only one, the loathsome Miss Rathcliffe. The moment I had seen her, I wished more than anything Davy would have gone feral and dived straight into the wretch. I certainly speak with a dramatic flair, but I'd wager any person alive, past, present, or future, would think just the same after speaking no more than 5 minutes with the woman. Of course, she had beelined towards us the very second she spotted Davy and I. The 3 or 4 minutes she prattled on felt like a lifetime in hell. I, of course, nodded my head in ignorant agreement towards which of the denizens in town had wronged her in some menial and very likely unbeknownst way. Only hearing every other word she spouted, I believe her prattling today had to do with a neighbor's cat that looked at her crossly. All the while, spittle let loose from Miss Rathcliffe's yellow-toothed mouth. When the time finally felt appropriate, I smiled at the tedious woman and told her I'd need to continue on or Davy could become a real menace without his proper exercise. She then screwed up her face and scowled at poor Davy before exhausting a large huff of frustration and skittered off. Finally, the secluded walkway grew silent once again. Davy zigzagged from side to side on the narrow path, snorting quickly as he took in every scent he could. Distracted by his haphazard manner, I came seconds away from failing to avoid a sheet of slick mud. A simple sidestep off the path remedied my issue. However, Davy marched directly onto the sheet of mud as he crossed to join me. The small impressions of 4 paws he left behind amused me. Had it been the Mona Lisa itself lying there on the ground, Davy would have changed nothing. With absolute indifference. If it meant getting to the next tree to urinate upon, Davy would sully any and all in his way. Getting back to the path forced us to go around a large section of shrubbery. The sweet floral scent, though this time arriving almost aggressively, had brought me to a complete halt. The aroma felt as though it had sharply shot directly into my senses. Taken so unaware, I winced and felt my eyes grow watery. A dull but throbbing sensation pulsed within the ridge of my nose, and a spout of dizziness took hold of me. Without a moment to grasp this rapid onset condition, my short-lived affliction fled instantly. I took a few moments to myself and considered the sudden fit. Perhaps the beginnings of seasonal allergies. Though I knew it was only an excuse, I had hoped to trick myself into believing. The caressing wind returned and once again brought the sweet aroma. I embraced the scent and found no issues, allowing me to assume the event was no more than a paradoxical error of the human body. I recollected myself and took a step to continue on until I noticed the fragrant floral smell no longer came from the direction in front of me. At least not any more. No, the smell had now come from above. That's when I saw it. The hive. It was a ragged, hideous thing hanging 15 feet in the air from one of the tree branches. The floral scent had vanished completely, replaced now by a pungent stench akin to moldy compost. The hive looked as though it had remained here much longer than its natural cycle should have allowed. Its exterior resembled torn linens, and each opening looked littered with various debris, leaving wiry twigs and clinging oak catkin dangling from the garish thing. I was disgusted, perhaps more than necessary. Nature could often be quite ugly, but this hideous hive raised above our heads had been looking down on every passerby unbeknownst to them for how many years? No longer. I believed it was time this grotesque oddity came down and suffered its overdue expiration. I secured Davy to a tree and sought an adequate projectile. There were enough rocks scattered around the area to take my pick. I chose 3 and began my assault. The first was a complete overshot, but not a terrible throw. A simple adjustment to allow for a better arc should have done the trick. The next throw was just right as the flung stone smacked directly into the hive's stem, just barely clinging to its perch. To say the descent of the blasted thing was anything other than lackluster would be an understatement. The hive, likely weightless and hollow inside, fell to the ground in more of a float rather than the victorious deathfall I had intended. Such foolishness. My juvenile actions feel so very uncharacteristic as I recite this story. Dear listener, you do not know me. You have no reason to believe the words of this rambling fool, but I tell you, with the wish for nothing more than the truth, I believe that I was guided, pushed, silently ordered to do as I did. Never before, but with the time I've had to allow for conjecture, I am of the opinion... No, I digress. Apologies, dear listener. So very pleased with my quick success, I watched the hive come down wearing an expression of childlike glee, though any expectations of an anticlimactic conclusion had ceased the moment the hive collapsed to the ground. The hellish thing had exhausted a black smog that obscured my vision entirely. The putrid stench of rotting compost intensified, forcing me to cover my mouth and nose rather than shielding my eyes from the smog. Within seconds, the black haze and stink dissipated, and only the fallen hive remained, though it had changed, looking almost deflated now, as much of the thing had sunk into itself. Completely dumbfounded by the perverse sight of the hive, I found myself entirely unable to look away. A whine from Davy broke my enthrallment, and when I turned to him, I saw an expression on his face I had never seen to that day. He had been frozen in place with his icy blue eyes locked on to the collapsed hive. It may sound irrational, and yet the expression Davy bore, that I came to believe, was dread. And it had been that which frightened me to my very core. I have trouble recollecting the walk back home. I do remember having much difficulty focusing the remainder of that day. The occurrence with the hive continued to permeate my every thought. Davy seemed to have felt the same as he returned to his bed after finishing his dinner, and restlessly tossed and turned the entire evening. I, on the other hand, sat at my desk and stared deeply into the oak surface, disregarding the pile of student papers waiting to be reviewed. It had been an hour past midnight before my despondency finally broke. I stood up from my desk as though a stranger in my own home and awkwardly walked myself to the bedroom. The following day felt as though life returned to normal, and I was able to devote the time necessary towards reviewing my students' papers. While not a habitual smoker, during times of stress I find tobacco helps to relieve tension. I stepped outside to strike a match, but became distracted when I found a sky looking as though I had never witnessed in my life. Colors I could not identify, layered on top of one another in patterns I perceived to be nothing other than alien. I forced my locked gaze from the sky and looked towards the street. Surely, had others seen as I have, a commotion of some sort would be in order. To my astonishment, on the ground level, all the folk of the town had gone about their day as ordinary as any other. I felt a rising panic bubble within my chest, and collapsed my face into my hands. With waves of worry infiltrating the blackness of my mind, I asked myself, was this the onset of insanity? The collecting beads of sweat from my forehead entered my eyes as I massaged my throbbing sockets. I hoped for nothing more than to look up and find that garish sky no more than a machination of a caffeine-flushed misconception. However, it revealed itself as a false hope. The next few days felt like one hazy blur. I remained inside my home and only took Davy outside to relieve himself as needed. I phoned the university and let them know I was ill and would be seeking treatment. Often peering outside from behind my draped curtains, I inspected every direction visible to me, though it is clear to me now that I was a victim of my own anxiety. Everything all at once had seemed to me both ordinary as well as aberrant. It wasn't until the night of the storm that I had come to realize all pre-existing comprehensions of the world we inhabit were akin to infantile naivete. There was no initial droplet to warn of the oncoming storm. The rain came on as though one had released a lever which contained an ocean of rainfall. The water cascaded onto the earth like crushing fists, pummeling all in its descent. Grumbling thunder bellowed in the distance like a growling beast waiting to strike. And when each strike finally came, I found the splintering white bolts angry as they ravaged the neighborhood. Hours passed, and the storm refused to relent. The bashing sound against the roof diminished any hopes of sleep this night, and so I laid there in sweat-soaked sheets, desperately in need of a wash, and stared off into nothing for hours. In the course of the initial days, thoughts of the hive were sparsely prevalent, but never at the forefront of my mind. Until something changed, and the hive appeared in the eye of my mind, and nothing could expel the damned thing. I felt as though I was standing inside a black tunnel, and could do naught but stare as the hive rested inside the blackness at the end of the corridor. The thought so persistent, I began to grow quite agitated. I violently jerked my neck from side to side and whacked my knuckles against my temples in hopes of physically clearing the vision inside. Yet, the image of the hive continued to dominate my every sense. And so, with no other choice, I succumbed and allowed the thought to do as it willed. Hundreds of painful drops of water stung my bare skin every second. I now found myself outside, leading in what seemed like a mindless direction. The invasive image of the hive somehow changed into a dire wanting and desire to see the hive once again. The image inside my mind no longer felt sufficient, and so I pushed through the harsh winds in hopes of reuniting with the hive. I slipped in and out of consciousness during this time, often finding myself in unfamiliar locations before a black shroud would take hold once again, only to wake and see my naked feet, raw and muddied, dragging me further, guided only by the warming hope to soon be with my beloved golden hive. Next, I found myself lying in the mud, shielded somewhat by a home blocking the thrashing rain. I felt as though some time had passed, though I couldn't specify how much. Night still stood, yet I had the feeling it had been many hours. Perhaps even days I wandered in that storm. I sluggishly brought myself to my feet, and within the suppressing rain, I heard the sound of footsteps draw towards me. From the clutching blackness, I saw the silhouette of a man. No, not a man, a thing. Rain splashed and bounced from its large, bulging head. Each unbalanced step it took let out a squishing sound as the mud and water separated under each footfall. Terror bellowed inside, but there was something else alongside it. Comfort, I believed. The creature moved slowly, and each step allowed me to identify more of just what had been approaching me. There hadn't been hands attached to any wrists. Instead, long, torn cloth-like appendages hung, flittering about. Its body itself proved to be inhuman, resembling soft, twisted, and rigid flesh bunched up into knots. Lightning struck nearby, and the crackling flash of light revealed the creature's face, or perhaps lack of one. Instead, it was the hive itself mounted onto the neck of this atrocious thing. Still, it continued to draw upon me. The whipping winds flailed the long, thin, and wiry hairs growing from out of the hive. I thought the lack of light a boon. The shadows did much to hide the terrifying clarity of the creature. The squelching mud grew louder and louder with each crooked step the creature took. Only a few steps remained, and my eyes twitched forcefully in demand, screaming at me to blink moisture back into them. However, I was no longer in control. I had become subservient to the fear. The hive finally stood over me, motionless. The rain dripped from its dome directly into my eyes, obscuring my sight further. I recall a calming sense of surreality gripping over me, feeling as though this event hadn't been truly happening and was instead a story being told to me, perhaps my mind working as a defense mechanism to protect itself from such an unnatural entity, one us humans had not been equipped to properly deal with. The simultaneous smell of rotten compost alongside the sweet floral aroma forcefully claimed my attention and returned me from my dreamy stupor. The creature hunched its back to lower its body and lifted a droopy hand towards my face. The amorphous appendage engulfed me as it draped over my nose, mouth, and eyes. My reaction turned to a muted shock at the perverse act. The hive's tendrils fell and wove on to one another as they investigated my face for only seconds before finding their destinations. Slowly creeping into each orifice, I felt the hive's tendrils beneath my skin, raising the flesh on my face as it drifted under the surface. Unidentifiable colors similar to the sky a few days ago flashed in the corners of my eyes. They swirled and blended together until my vision had become replaced by a now serene landscape in front of me. The bright, vibrant colors in the alien sky swam in subtle, gentle movements as though they themselves had been alive. That place, so very strange, invoked a calm of peace and serenity. Why had this creature shown me such a sight? A large, splashing rain droplet plopped onto my forehead and shook my conscience, partially dragging reality within the bestowed vision. Before me, the perplexing landscape sat as a backdrop to the creature's bulbous crown at the forefront. The calming beauty of the landscape had not been enough to distract from the hideous hive. Laden with disgust, I twinged at the sight of the gaping holes spread across the hive, which felt like tens of emotionless black eyes gawking at me all at once. The creature felt my resistance, and the pressure inside my head grew, intensely throbbing like a deep headache. I continued to descend and made the attempt to pull away. The creature pressed further into me, though I managed to muster my strength and physically grabbed its tendrils, pulling them from my face. Suddenly, a vision of violent, blazing fires and the sensation of anger jolted within me. However, I continued to refuse and tore the last of the hive's tendrils out from my nose and mouth. Once removed, blood and mucus splashed onto the muddy ground, and I suspected death would soon be next. A long gap of inaction followed. My eyelids grew heavy, and the sound of the storm drowned out all else. Exhaustion took hold, and I could no longer remain conscious. I woke to the cold, wet bump of Davy's nose prodding me. Somewhat disorientated, but no more than that. Had it all been a dream, I thought to myself? Had the stress of the past few days culminated into that demented nightmare? No, I have no concrete evidence, dear listener, but the events that had followed intersect too closely for such a thing to have been coincidence. Never had I planned to take the role of the recluse, and yet my proclivity to stock my cupboard of canned goods and whiskey seemed to say otherwise. The following days bled into one another, and my circadian rhythm remained completely unbalanced. I slept through most mornings and spent nights either wandering my home or keeping a watchful eye on the world outside. Countless nights passed. I had taken my phone off the ringer after receiving too many repeating calls. Likely the university, wondering whatever came of me. At times the neighbors would come to my door and call out my name. Even the boy Eugene stopped by to ask about Davy. I shooed him away, telling him I was too ill to open the door, and confirmed that Davy had been just fine, which had been the only lie I hadn't told. This madness was mine to descend, and I refused to allow poor Davy to be taken down with me. One night I could hear an argument from one of the nearby neighbors, so close that I could make out every word lashed out at one another. What started as a minor disagreement regarding dishes being washed after dinner quickly sunk into violent, berating words that often made no contextual sense. One would end a sentence in a gargling screech, while the other would rebut with crackling clicks of a tongue. The fight ended in a sudden thud, followed by a moaning wail, and then, moments later, another thud. A week later, on a rare night I had been sleeping, I awoke to the smell of burning wood. Running to my window, I found many of the homes ignited in flames, and the people outside cheering with joy. When I caught a glimpse of the arsonists, it had been the very faces of those that dwelled inside those homes, who cheered to their fiery collapse. Once the roaring flames subsided into low crackles and the popping of the remaining wood, I could hear a man with a gravelly voice give words of comfort to his family. I spent the next few weeks in a drunken stupor, refusing to dare look out the window for fear of what would be next to come. One afternoon, I had been grooming Davy when I heard a light scratching at my window. Ignoring it at first, I continued to tend to Davy, but even after I had finished, the scratching continued. I filled my dirty bourbon glass and, in one gulp, swallowed the brown courage. Feeling the overwhelming amount of liquid tingle throughout my body, I took as quiet a few steps I could towards my window to investigate the scratching. The closer I came, an intense pressure filled my gut as though I had swallowed an iron anvil. I continued nonetheless and slowly peeled the corner of the curtain back, only wide enough to peek through. The intense daylight shocked my dusky eyes, forcing me to blink many times before I could tolerate the bright ray of light. I saw nothing, only the charred black stained onto the wooden framework left behind onto the burning homes. The scratching returned, and I shifted my gaze in the sound's direction. What I found there sent a wave of terror that gripped my body like a clenched fist. Looking up at me were two eyes, set so wide apart from one another they were practically on the sides of the temples. A short, wide-bridged nose with thin slits as nostrils puffed as they struggled to exhaust each breath of tightly bound air. At the lower half, an elongated stretch of skin below the septum of at least 2 inches before the thin lips protruded. Its skin looked sticky and wet and bore a tinge of pale green, invoking my assumption this creature was in quite an unhealthy state. I peered deeper at the cursed thing and saw a vague but familiar resemblance behind its deformities. Before I could think further on the matter, a gravelly voice from the distance yelled, "Unworthy." Immediately, the sound of many rushing footsteps gathered towards my window. In an instant, I jerked my body towards the floor to hide, and listened as I heard the sound of crunching wax and thuds alongside the multiple voices repeating that same word over and over. Unworthy. I fell asleep in place below the window, and when I awoke hours later, it came to me. The creature. It had been Miss Radcliffe. After that, more drunken stupors spread out across a stretch of time I no longer bothered to keep track of. I always enjoyed the taste of whiskey, but now it had become my lifeline, my protector, my detachment to all of this lunacy. I stroked Davy's thick fur as we both ate our next can of peas for the 100th time. He had been such a good sport about it all. Not as though he could, but not once did he seem to complain. He pawed my leg when he saw the cadence of my hand waver, reminding me to get back on track. I could ask for no better companion. Panic came when I entered the cupboard and found we were coming to the end of our supply. I spent the rest of the day hoping to plan out our next steps, but deep inside I could feel the cowardice taunting me, knowing full well I would be unable to step out into that madness. That night it finally came to our door. When I heard the pounding reverberate through the home, I felt many things. Horror, of course, but also relief, I think. Relief that while whatever horrible event I would have to endure, it might finally mean the end of this monstrous nightmare. And to that I became somewhat elated. But then I heard a familiar voice. A child. It was Eugene. He pounded on the door as hard as he could. Davy recognized the boy's voice as he perked up and let out a muffled whine. I hushed him and remained in place. Eugene spoke in a muted but frantic tone. He knocked on the door after each time he spoke and explained his mother was with him and that she had been badly injured. I listened as the poor boy pleaded and begged, believing I was the only one who could help him now. Davy looked upset and began pacing between both sides of the room. Again, Eugene continued, wholly believing that I was indeed behind the door, and begged me to help. I took a step towards the door and placed my hands on the lock. Then I heard him let out a whelp and shout, "They found us. Please let us in. We'll be safe in there with you." Eugene panicked and pounded the door with greater intensity as I stood there on the other side, motionless. I heard the sound of a gravelly man's voice as he took Eugene and his mother. I heard them butcher the boy and his mother while I stood there hiding in what I came to realize was no more than a cage I had locked myself inside. And that marks the end of the whiskey. I have only one can of peas left, which I'm going to save for Davy. I took the planks off the door earlier today and stepped outside with a sense of confident carelessness. The neighborhood had been clear for the moment. In complete ruins, but not a single person, or whatever they've become, in sight. I gave Davy the choice to leave, but the pup refused, turning back and laying on his bed. I still am unsure what my plans going forward will be. Perhaps I'll sit here until my body shuts down or someone bursts through the door and bashes my head in. I thank you for listening to my woeful tale. I only hope that there is some benefit towards what one can glean from me. And maybe you can answer the questions I could not. Was I the catalyst to the state of things? Was I beckoned and covertly persuaded as the spark to this unspeakable chaos? I have debated these topics to a point where I simply stop and laugh from the absurd confusion. And such, I have put a stop to the conjecture completely. Perhaps the world is in better shape than what I witnessed in this small, once ordinary though lovely neighborhood. For all I know, I've made it all up, and in actuality have delved into the deepest depths of pure madness. Truly, I hope that is the case. If so, please take good care of Davy for me. He is a good boy.